Greetings, seekers of truth in history's murkiest depths. Today we plunge into an abyss of human audacity and blatant unscrupulousness so profound that even the most hardened cynic might feel a slight dizziness. Forget noble kings and valiant knights. Before you stands Concino Concini, a name that became a brand of shame on the French monarchy, synonymous with boundless corruption and absolute moral decay. If you thought you knew the limits of human depravity, prepare yourselves. We are just beginning. Picture this. France, a mighty nation, shaken by internal strife and external threats. And at its head, not a king, not experienced ministers, not heroes of past battles. No. Leading this parade of absurdity was who? An Italian. An adventurer without lineage or standing, without any military experience. A man who couldn't wield a sword but managed to become a Marshal of France. A marshal who had never seen combat, yet his orders were but an anatomy of parasitism. His sole true merit, his main asset, his golden ticket to high society and absolute power. It wasn't military victories or diplomatic successes. It was the Queen's bed. Yes, you heard that right. Concino Concini was not just a favorite. He was the lover of Marie de Medici, the Regent of France, mother of the young King Louis XIII. And this scandalous liaison, this whisper through the palace corridors, this dirty secret known to all but spoken by none, became the cornerstone of his power. How was such a thing even possible? How could a nobody, who arrived in France in the retinue of the future queen as her servant, a simple man from nowhere, in a matter of years not only amass vast riches, not only adorn himself with titles that the oldest aristocrats dared not dream of, but effectively subjugate all of France? To turn the state treasury into his personal piggy bank and the royal administration into his personal staff. This is not just a story about the rise and fall of one man. It is a mirror reflecting a system rotten to the core, ready to bow to anyone who could manipulate the weaknesses of the powerful. It is a textbook on how greed, unscrupulousness, and sexual intrigue can become more potent than any army or legitimate authority. We will dissect not only his life, but also that repulsive, reeking, atmosphere of court intrigue, betrayal, and moral decay in which Concini not only survived, but flourished like a poisonous flower. We will show how he exploited every crack in the system, every weakness in the Queen's character, every corrupt official. This will be a dive into the darkest corners of the human soul, where ambition knows no bounds and conscience has long been soundly asleep. But before we reach the moment when this marshal without a sword had to face real steel, we need to understand where this phenomenon came from. What force, what set of circumstances, spawned such a monster? Where was that starting point, that first seed, which grew into this gigantic weed on the body of the French monarchy? We have already broadly sketched a portrait of a kingdom held hostage by a man who was, in essence, merely a high-ranking servant. But how, for heaven's sake, does a simple valet become a de facto ruler? The answer lies not only in the Queen's weakness, but also in the untamed, raw ambition of a man who understood the mechanics of power long before his hand first grasped a marshal's baton. Concino Concini, a name that today echoes like a long-past scandal, but then it was synonymous with absolute impunity and shamelessness. He was not born in a golden cradle, nor was he a descendant of ancient lines whose blood smelled of history and privilege. He was, in essence, a nobody. A minor Florentine nobleman from Pisa, whose family could barely boast of anything beyond very distant, peripheral connections to the powerful house of Medici. And it was this nothingness that became his main driving force, his fuel. Imagine a person who, from childhood, absorbed the air of palace backrooms, but always stood by the back entrance, saw the glitter, heard the whispers, felt the scent of power, but was denied access. His ambition was not just a desire to succeed. It was a burning, almost painful need to prove to the world, and first and foremost to himself, that he was not only worthy of this world, but capable of subjugating it. It was not merely a thirst for wealth, but a compensatory fury, a desire to erase the upstart label, to rise above those who looked down on him. He wanted not just to become part of the elite, but to become its summit, to break the system that had spawned him, but not accepted him. His point of no return, the moment Concini realized that his destiny would not be tied to service but to domination, came when he met Leonora Dori. This woman, an Italian, Marie de Medici's lady-in-waiting, was not just a friend of the future queen. She was her shadow, her mirror, her ears and eyes. Leonora possessed what Concini lacked, Marie's absolute, unwavering trust. She was the key to the royal bedchamber, to the royal mind, to the royal heart. And Concini, this predator with impeccable instincts, could not pass by such prey. Their connection was not a sentimental love affair, but a cold, cynical calculation, a perfect symbiosis of two souls poisoned by the thirst for power, two sharks in one tank, deciding that together they could devour all the fish. Leonora, perhaps no less obsessed with power than Concini, lacked his audacity, his strategic thinking, his ruthlessness. He was her brain. She was his access. She provided intimate proximity to the queen, and he provided the plan for her exploitation. Their relationship was a pathological bond where each used the other to achieve their own, even grander goals. Marie de Medici's court was the ideal breeding ground for such parasites. France in the early 17th century was not a bastion of chivalry and honor, but a swamp of intrigue where everyone sold out for jingling coins or a title. The royal court, instead of being the center of state governance, had become a hotbed of favoritism, rampant embezzlement, and moral decay. Ministers sold offices, nobles sold their votes, and the throne itself was merely a tool for personal enrichment. Marie de Medici, a woman whose virtue was questionable and political acumen even more so, proved to be an ideal victim. She was weak in character, emotionally dependent, easily swayed by flattery, and most importantly, completely blind to the true motives of those around her. She needed those who would flatter her vanity, solve her minor problems, listen to her endless complaints, and soothe her paranoia. And Concini, through Leonora, became precisely that person. He skillfully played on her fears, her insecurity, her desire to be loved, and to control everything, even if that control was merely an illusion. He didn't just exploit the queen's weaknesses, he turned them into a weapon of unprecedented power. He saw how easy it was to buy loyalty, how simple to manipulate vanity, how effective to intimidate the weaker ones. Courtly customs played right into his hands. No one would be surprised if the queen's favorite began to enrich himself. Everyone did it. The only difference was the scale and the shamelessness. Concini didn't just take, he plundered with such audacity that it shocked even hardened courtiers. He didn't just ask, he demanded with an arrogance worthy of a monarch. His thirst for wealth was insatiable, his opportunism absolute. He understood that in a world where honor was just an empty word and law merely a recommendation for fools, victory went to the one willing to go to any lengths, unburdened by conscience or moral principles. He was a master of backroom games, a puppeteer who pulled invisible strings while no one saw him tying them to the hands and feet of his marionettes. And as France plunged into chaos, torn by internal strife and external threats, Concini built his personal empire, brick by brick, from gold and blood. His ascent was not just a career climb. It was a triumph of vice over virtue, of calculated depravity over naive faith. And precisely how he did it, how he built his colossal financial and political pyramid, how he manipulated an entire country, deserves a separate, more detailed discussion that will reveal the true extent of his unprecedented audacity. So, Concino Concini, Marshal, without a sword. A man who went from servant to de facto king of France. How did he do it? Not by magic, not by brilliant strategy, but by the mundane, shameless, perfected art of parasitizing on others' weaknesses and state rot. His ascent is not a success story, but an anatomy of the disease that afflicted the French monarchy. At the peak of his power, Concini didn't just live lavishly. He was the lavish foot upon which the entire rotting structure of the Regency stood. His insatiability knew no bounds, and his methods were as simple as 3 sous. If something could be sold, stolen, or extorted, it would be done. The systematic accumulation of vast riches and titles became his calling card, his personal manifesto, if you will. He bought and resold government positions, turning them into personal assets. Governorships, military posts, court sinecures, all were auctioned off, not for the treasury, but for Concini's pocket. Provinces groaned under the yoke of his appointees, squeezing the last drops from the populace, to buy off the marshal's favor or wrath. He became a Marshal of France, though he had never commanded a single company in his life. He was a duke, a peer, a first minister, but in essence, the chief embezzler and pimp of the crown. Think about it. A man with no noble birth, no military merits, nor even any notable talents beyond the ability to manipulate a single woman, appropriated all the regalia that could be appropriated. And most importantly, he turned the kingdom's treasury into his personal piggy bank. Money flowed like a river, but not for the needs of the state, not for the army, not for maintaining France's prestige. It settled in his endless castles, was transformed into jewels for Leonora, into lavish balls designed to blind and humiliate those who still remembered what honor was. He wallowed in gold, demonstratively trampling all norms of decency, and the more he took, the stronger grew his confidence in his own impunity. This was not just corruption. It was an open, brazen declaration of a new world order, where power is not given, but bought and sucked from the living body of the nation. But money, as is well known, does not buy everything, especially when it comes to proud, albeit often short-sighted, French nobles. Amidst the growing anarchy caused by the weakness of the Regency, rebellious aristocrats, led by Prince de Condé, began to openly oppose the Italian clique. Concini, accustomed to resolving all issues through purchase, naively believed that Condé could also be bought. He offered him fabulous sums, positions, privileges, anything, just to make him shut up and leave. This was his plan, not to fight, not to negotiate, but simply to throw enough gold to stifle any discontent. The execution was as straightforward as it was naive. Concini, personally or through his emissaries, tried to tame Condé, offering him mind-boggling bribes and promises. But Condé, for all his ambition and greed, possessed one quality Concini could not understand. He valued power more than money. He saw that Concini had usurped real power, not just enriched himself. The unexpected turn was that Condé not only refused the bribe, he exposed it publicly, highlighting Concini's baseness and impotence. This was not just the failure of one of his schemes, it was a slap in the face to the all-powerful Marshal. The consequences were catastrophic for Concini's prestige. He showed that his omnipotence had limits, that not everything was for sale. This fueled the rebellion, strengthened the ranks of his opponents, and forced him to resort to harsher, and thus riskier measures. He began to perceive any disagreement as a personal insult, intensifying repression, which only dug his grave deeper. He reveled in power but did not understand its nature, confusing it with impunity, which became his fatal error. And of course, we cannot overlook the most scandalous and public aspect of his ascent, his shameless, open affair with Queen Marie de Medici. This was more than just a love affair. It was a demonstration of absolute power and complete contempt for conventions. Rumors circulated that Concini had built a special bridge of love, connecting his mansion to the Louvre, allowing him to enter the Queen's chambers unimpeded. Whether this bridge was a real structure or a metaphor is not as important as its symbolism. Concini had so merged with the body of the monarchy, so brazenly and openly demonstrated his dominance over the Queen, that it became a byword. His plan was obvious: to openly solidify his status as favorite, to make it an undeniable fact, to dare to challenge anyone who doubted his right to the royal bed. The execution was perfected. He was omnipresent by Marie's side. His influence on her decisions was evident. His presence in her private chambers was not concealed. The Queen herself, at times unconsciously, encouraged this display, for in her emotional dependence on Concini, she saw in him not only a lover, but also a pillar and protection. The court's reaction was a mixture of disgust, envy, and icy terror. Nobles, accustomed to favorites, but not to such a blatant and base union, felt humiliated. The populace, always sensitive to the moral decay of elites, openly hated the Italian upstart who had disgraced the crown and dishonored France. It was a public scourging of the monarchy's prestige, which Concini carried out with relish, enjoying every humiliated glance, every whisper behind his back. The consequences were devastating. He not only undermined the authority of the Queen Regent, but also made enemies whose hatred was not merely political, but deeply personal, moral. He believed that the Queen was his absolute shield, his guarantee of impunity. And this belief, this feeling of absolute security, blinded him, preventing him from seeing that behind Marie de Medici, another, far more dangerous force was already rising, capable of tearing apart his web with a single movement. We left Concini at the peak of his shameless power, but any authority built on decay inevitably spawns its own gravediggers. The octopus he spread throughout France had not only tentacles, but also a fertile ground and, more importantly, internal enemies who were merely waiting for their moment. His universe was far more complex than just a love triangle or a corruption scheme. It was a carefully constructed, albeit outrageously brazen, empire, where at every level sat people who received their share of the common feast. Of course, Marie de Medici and Leonora Dori were not just patrons. They were the cornerstone, the very bridge by which Concini paved his way to the royal bedchamber and treasury. Marie, that perpetually indecisive, perpetually doubting regent, clung to Concini like a drowning person to a straw. He gave her the illusion of control, the illusion of strength, while he himself disemboweled the state. And Leonora, she was his eyes and ears with the queen, his loyal Cerberus, cutting off all undesirables and reporting every whisper. Their dependence on Concini, their fear of losing him, was his main insurance. But Concini was not alone. He didn't just steal. He built his network, attracting greedy and unscrupulous nobles ready to sell their title, their honor, their lineage for a shower of gold. These hired nobles, as they were called, were a new kind of aristocracy, not hereditary, not of service, but acquired. They received positions, governorships, military posts, which they bought from Concini for exorbitant sums, and then recouped these investments by shamelessly plundering the provinces. It was a vicious cycle, where each new turn of corruption only strengthened Concini's position, creating around him a cocoon of people whose well-being directly depended on his power. He was their godfather, and they were his army. However, this army was but a drop in the ocean of hatred that seethed within the French nobility. The old guard, the hereditary aristocrats, whose honor had been trampled by this upstart, yearned for vengeance. For them, Concini was not just a corrupt official, he was an insult, a spit in the face of France itself. They were ready to teach him a lesson, and their numbers grew with each new scandal, with each new title sold. In this tangled web of intrigue and hatred, the main antagonists emerged. Prince de Condé, a Bourbon heir, was not merely one of the rebellious aristocrats. He was a symbol of resistance. His refusal of Concini's enormous bribe, his public exposure of the attempted payoff, was not just a political maneuver, but a declaration of war. Condé, with his ambition and thirst for real power, not just money, posed a direct threat. He was the one who could unite the scattered forces of the opposition. And of course, there was Cardinal Richelieu. At the time, he was not yet the all-powerful Grey Cardinal, but he was already an ambitious bishop who, like a snake, observed this entire bacchanal. Richelieu was part of Marie de Medici's court, even for a time associated with Concini, but he saw further than the Italian adventurer. He saw not just an opportunity for enrichment, but an opportunity to build a new, strong France. For this, Concini was merely an obstacle, a festering wound that needed to be lanced. Richelieu was a cold, calculating strategist who understood that to achieve his goals, it was necessary to eliminate not just a man, but the entire system he had created. He did not engage in open confrontation. He wove his web in the shadows, watching, waiting, preparing for the decisive move. But Concini's most formidable enemy grew right under his nose, the young Louis XIII. Downtrodden, withdrawn, humiliated by Concini, who openly slept with his mother and effectively ruled his kingdom, Louis was not just a boy. He was the embodiment of suppressed rage, humiliated pride, and absolute despair. His hatred for Concini was deep, personal, and it had accumulated over years, transforming into something far more dangerous than any political intrigue. Concini, blinded by his power and certainty of impunity, failed to see that he himself had forged the weapon that would one day be turned against him. And this weapon was not merely a dagger or poison, it was the will of a king, which, once awakened, would sweep away everything in its path. This web of connections, this struggle for influence, this escalating anger, all led to an inevitable clash. And when it happened, it was not just a political assassination, but an act of brutal, almost ritualistic vengeance. The air of Paris, permeated with intrigue and the stench of corruption, thickened to an unbearable density. Young Louis XIV, whom we are accustomed to seeing as a spineless boy, a puppet in the hands of his mother and her lover, was in fact a quiet, withdrawn, but mortally dangerous predator. Years of humiliation, years of watching the upstart Concini usurp his power, his mother, his country, forged in him a cold determination. This was not a youthful rebellion, but a carefully planned operation to eliminate a threat. The conspiracy ripened in silence, in the shadows of the royal chambers, where de Luynes, the king's favorite, whispered to him about the necessity of action. The decision was made. Not arrest, not trial, but a public execution. Concini was not just an official. He was a symbol of decay, a festering sore on the body of France. And such sores are not treated. They are lanced. The order was given to the captain of the royal guard, de Vitry, a man who himself had once been favored by Concini, but whose loyalty, like that of many at court, depended on the shifting winds. Power is not only what you take, but also what you lose when you are no longer needed. And at that moment, Concini was no longer needed, even by those he had fed from his hand. The morning of April 24th, 1617. Paris was still asleep, but tension already hung heavy over the Louvre bridge. Concini, as always, was unperturbed and arrogant. He was heading to the palace, once again demonstrating his power, unaware that this was his last promenade. His retinue, accustomed to his untouchability, followed him relaxed. Suddenly their path was blocked by de Vitry and his men. The atmosphere instantly crackled. "Marshal, I arrest you by order of the king," de Vitry declared sharply. Concini, accustomed to flattery and subservience, merely sneered contemptuously. He tried to brush off the guards. Perhaps even reached for his sword. A gesture that, in his situation, was tantamount to suicide. And that was precisely what they were waiting for. Shots shattered the morning silence. One bullet pierced his head, another his chest. Concini collapsed, without even realizing that his omnipotence had ended. He, a Marshal of France without a single day on the battlefield, met his death not in the heat of battle but in a cowardly ambush, like a cornered rat. His retinue? Those very friends who had sworn loyalty to him just yesterday, instantly vanished. The betrayal was swift, almost instinctive. Everyone saved their own skin, abandoning their once all-powerful patron to be torn apart. At that moment it became clear that his empire rested not on loyalty, but on fear and greed. In the palace, Marie de Medici, hearing the shots, initially experienced shock. Her Concini, her support, her lover, her all-powerful favorite. Dead? But shock quickly gave way to pragmatic terror. She realized her power had collapsed with him. In an instant she disavowed him, turning away as if from the plague. "I have nothing to do with that man," she declared, trying to salvage the remnants of her influence. It was a cold, calculated move, but it only highlighted her own weakness and dependence. She was a queen, but without Concini, she was merely a frightened woman who had lost her puppeteer. News of Concini's death spread through Paris like wildfire, and immediately the thunder of popular wrath erupted. The crowd, driven to despair by his extortions, his audacity, his ostentatious luxury, surged towards the bridge. What happened next was not merely an act of retribution. It was a ritual of purification, a wild, primal outpouring of hatred. Concini's body, still warm, was mutilated, dragged through the streets, hung by the feet, then dismembered and burned. His heart, according to rumor, was eaten by someone from the crowd, an act of cannibalism symbolizing the consumption of his power and his sins. This was not just a murder. It was the annihilation of his memory, his legacy, his very being. The popular fury did not stop at his corpse. It descended upon everything connected with Concini. The bridge he had built to connect his mansion to the Louvre, that very bridge of love, which had become a symbol of his shameless liaison with the Queen, was torn down to its foundations. Stone by stone, as if trying to erase his very existence from the city's history. This was not merely destruction. It was a cry, a collective no to tyranny and corruption. Marie de Medici was left alone, imprisoned, in despair, in full realization that her world had collapsed. Her grief was mixed with horror. She had lost not only a lover but also her political power, her freedom. And Paris rejoiced. rejoiced to the point of madness, to frenzy, to a frenzied, almost bloody, rage. It was a moment of triumph for the common people over arrogant power, over the brazen upstart who dared to disregard all written and unwritten laws. It was a lesson for all who think that money and proximity to the throne can protect them from true, unadulterated hatred. But what does this lesson truly tell us about the nature of power, about those who seek it, and about those who obtain it? And how often does history repeat itself, changing only the scenery and names, but leaving human greed and the desire for dominance unchanged? His mutilated body, dragged through the streets of Paris, torn to pieces and burned in the Place de Grève, became more than just an execution. It was a bloody, wild auto-da-fe over the very idea of power built on lies, corruption, and bedchamber intrigues. The populace, driven to despair, demanded